The backstage moment that made Bruce Lee say, "Chuck is the only man who worries me." Rome, Italy, September 1971. A Wednesday evening, close to 9 o'clock. The air in the production office at the back of the rented studio space near Cinecittà had been recirculated so many times by the portable fans that it had stopped feeling like air and had started feeling like the memory of air. Warm and slightly stale, carrying the overlapping residues of cigarettes and hair tonic, and the chemical smell of fresh photographic prints that someone had hung to dry on a wire strung between the window frame and the top of the steel shelving unit against the far wall. Outside, the Roman evening was doing what Roman evenings do in September, which is to say it was warm in a way that has depth to it, warmth that has accumulated through the day and stored itself in the stone of the buildings and the asphalt of the roads, and that gives back what it has stored slowly, reluctantly, so that the temperature drops but the heat does not leave. The production company that would release The Way of the Dragon had been working in Rome for 6 days. The film was Bruce Lee's in the most complete sense. He had written it, he was directing it, he was producing it through Concord Productions, and he had structured the financial arrangement in a way that gave him control over every major decision from the casting to the color correction of the final print. He was 30 years old. He had not yet released Enter the Dragon, which was still in negotiation, but he had completed The Big Boss, and Fist of Fury, in the Chinese-speaking world, understood that it was watching something unprecedented. The English-speaking world was about to find out. He was, in September of 1971, moving at a velocity that frightened the people around him. Not the physical velocity, though that was extraordinary enough. The intellectual velocity, the speed at which he processed information, discarded what was not useful, retained what was, and then transformed what was retained into something new. He was reading 6 books at a time and synthesizing them against each other. He was filming during the day and writing in the evenings and training in the hours that were left over, which should not have been enough hours and were enough hours because he had made them be enough. The people who worked with him on the film, the crew from Hong Kong and the Italian technical staff, and the cast he had assembled from various corners of the martial arts world, understood that they were in the presence of something that had a shorter fuse than it seemed. Not a fuse toward anger or instability, a fuse toward completion. He was moving toward something, and the movement was not going to slow down. He had brought Chuck Norris to Rome for the role of Colt, the American fighter who would face Bruce's character in the climactic scene at the Colosseum. The choice was deliberate and layered. Chuck was the reigning world karate champion. Bruce had known him for 3 years, since their first meeting at the 1969 Long Beach International Karate Championships. And their friendship was by this point real, in the way that friendships between people who train together can be real, grounded in the specific honesty of bodies that have tested each other and found each other worthy. Bruce had watched Chuck compete and train and teach. He understood, in the technical terms that mattered to him, what Chuck was. He had also chosen Chuck because he needed someone who would not disappear on screen beside him. This was not a small consideration. Bruce Lee on film was a presence of such specific density that most men placed next to him became peripheral, became background, became the problem that the film's protagonist was solving rather than a person with their own weight in reality. Chuck, Bruce believed, had a quality that would resist this. He had a stillness that was not passivity. He had a physical presence that did not need to announce itself. Bruce wanted the audience to believe, for at least a portion of the scene, that the outcome was genuinely in doubt. Chuck had arrived in Rome 4 days before the start of principal photography, which was 2 days before Bruce arrived. He had spent those 4 days walking the city and working out in the courtyard of the guest house where the production had housed the cast, and he had thought about the scene, which he had read in the script Bruce had sent him to Los Angeles, and which he had reread on the plane and which he had continued to think about since he arrived. The scene was one of the great martial arts sequences ever put to paper, which is to say it was a fight scene, but a fight scene in which both fighters were presented as complete human beings rather than as symbols, and in which the outcome meant something, because the audience would understand what was being lost, as well as what was being won. Chuck knew what he was being asked to do. He was being asked to be good enough that losing meant something. This is a specific kind of request. It requires a particular form of generosity, the willingness to be genuinely dangerous so that the danger is real, the willingness to press without reservation, knowing that the story requires the press to fail. Not many people can do this. It requires the separation of ego from craft, the understanding that the best thing you can do for a scene in which you lose is to be the best possible version of the thing that gets beaten. Chuck had thought about this on the plane and in the courtyard and on the long walks through the Trastevere district in the evenings, and he had arrived at the conclusion that he could do it, and that doing it well would require him to show Bruce everything he had without reservation, because a half-committed performance of a character at full commitment does not work. The camera sees the difference. He and Bruce had been training together for 2 days when the evening in the production office happened. They had worked in the morning in the large rehearsal space adjacent to the studio, blocking out the sequence, and then running sections of it at reduced speed and then at fuller speed. And Chuck had understood by the end of the first day that Bruce was doing something in the preparation of the scene that was not primarily about film choreography. He was studying. He was watching Chuck's specific mechanics, the timing of his techniques, the patterns of his movement under pressure, the way he solved the particular problem of someone moving toward him in a way that required an immediate response. He was doing this with the systematic attention that Chuck recognized from the way he himself approached a new training partner, and he was filing what he observed in the way that a man files things when he intends to use them. This was not a performance. Bruce was not performing research for the scene. He was doing what he always did, which was learning, which was extracting information from every available source, which meant that training with Chuck Norris was, for Bruce Lee, an opportunity that he was not going to manage at less than full capacity. On the second evening, they worked later than planned. The rehearsal space had cleared out around 7, the crew gone home or back to their accommodations, and Bruce and Chuck had continued working because there was something in the afternoon session that neither of them was ready to leave. A specific exchange in the third act of the sequence, a section in which Colt makes his last sustained attack, and the outcome hangs in that particular suspension that good fight scenes can achieve, where both things are simultaneously possible, and the audience stops breathing. They had run this section 6 times, and it was not yet what it needed to be, and both of them knew it, and neither of them wanted to stop until it was closer. It was Chuck who eventually said that they should call it for the night. His legs were tired in a specific way that told him the quality of work was declining, which was its own kind of information. Time to stop. Bruce, he could see, was not tired in the same way, or was operating from a different calculation about the acceptable cost of continuing, which was a pattern Chuck had observed in him before, and which was one of the things that made Bruce who he was, and also, Chuck thought, one of the things that would eventually cost him something. They wound down. They stretched in silence. The rehearsal space was very quiet at that hour, the sounds of the production day entirely gone, only the distant low-frequency rumble of Rome existing outside the walls. Bruce said, without preamble in the middle of the stretching, "You're different from the others." Chuck looked at him. "The other fighters I've worked with, watched, trained against?" Bruce was looking at the floor as he spoke, holding a stretch, his voice conversational, the tone of someone reporting an observation rather than offering a compliment. "They have one mode. They have the way they fight, and they fight that way. And when you understand the way, you understand the fighter." Chuck waited. "You're not like that," Bruce said. "Every time I think I have the pattern changes. Not randomly. It changes in response to what I'm doing. You're solving the problem in real time, not executing a solution you prepared earlier." He straightened up. He looked at Chuck. "I have to pay attention to you in a different way than I pay attention to most people." Chuck said, "You do the same thing." Bruce smiled. It was a real smile, the one that appeared when something struck him as accurately observed. "I try," he said. "It's rarer than people think." They went to the production office, where someone had left coffee in a metal pot on the hot plate, and they sat and drank it, and the conversation moved through several things. The sequence, the film, the development of what Bruce was calling Jeet Kune Do, which Chuck had heard described and had seen applied in their training sessions, and which he found genuinely interesting in the way that someone with a deep grounding in a traditional system finds genuinely interesting a philosophy that challenges the premises of that grounding without dismissing them. They did not agree about everything. They had not agreed about everything in the 3 years they had known each other. They had the kind of friendship that is built on the tension between two serious people with different but complementary understandings of a shared subject, and this tension was generative rather than adversarial. At some point in this conversation, which had by then been going on for close to an hour and had moved from the specific mechanics of the film scene to larger questions about what martial arts was actually for and what it meant to be good at it, in the real and complete sense of the word good, Bruce said something that was not addressed to Chuck directly. He had been talking about a sequence of encounters he had arranged over the preceding 2 years, sessions with fighters from various traditions that he had set up specifically to test the ideas he was developing, to stress test his system against the actual capabilities of the best available people. He named several of these encounters and what he had learned from them, and then he paused. "Chuck is the only man who worries me," he said. He said it in the same conversational register as everything else, the register of someone reporting an observation, not performing a sentiment. Not in the sense of being afraid. I don't mean that. I mean the other kind of worry. He looked for a word and found it. The productive kind. The kind where you know someone can show you something about your own limits that you can't show yourself. He was not looking at Chuck when he said this. He was looking at the window, where the Roman night was doing its slow, warm business outside. He said it as a statement of fact, in the same tone one might use to report an ambient temperature or a distance. He then moved on to the next thought without dwelling on what he had said, the way people move on from truths that seem to them self-evident and not in need of emphasis. The man he was saying it to was Larry Harbour, a production assistant who had been in the office when they arrived, working through the schedule for the following week's shoot. Harbour was 24 years old from Vancouver and had come to the production through a contact in the Hong Kong film industry that he had been cultivating with the specific tenacity of someone who understands that being in the right room at the right moment is itself a skill. He had been trying to finish his work quietly while Bruce and Chuck talked, and had largely succeeded in being invisible, which is the prerequisite for being present for things that are not performed for an audience. He set down his pencil when Bruce said it. He did not say anything. He looked at his schedule and then picked up his pencil again and continued working. Chuck heard it. He did not respond to it. He responded to the next thing Bruce said, which was about the Coliseum sequence and the specific quality of light in the late afternoon at that location that he wanted to capture in the shoot. The conversation moved on. The coffee got cold. Eventually, they went back to their accommodations. Larry Harbour stayed in the production industry for the rest of his working life, eventually making his way into documentary production, and later into producing work for a Hong Kong-based studio. He told the story of the evening in the production office a number of times over the years, always with the same care for accuracy that characterized his professional work. He was specific about what Bruce said and how he said it. He was specific that Chuck did not respond to it, and he had his own interpretation of this, which was that Chuck understood the particular nature of what had been said and recognized that responding to it would be the wrong thing to do. It wasn't a compliment in the ordinary sense, Harbour would say. Bruce wasn't telling Chuck he thought he was great. Bruce was telling himself something about himself in Chuck's presence. He was admitting that there is a specific kind of useful limitation that you can only encounter through a specific kind of other person, and that he had found that person. That is not easy to say. It takes a particular honesty about your own edges to say it. He would pause. Chuck not saying anything back was the right response. If he'd acknowledged it directly, it would have become a different kind of statement. He let it be what it was. The Coliseum sequence was filmed over 3 days in October, and it is, by any honest measurement, one of the finest fight sequences ever committed to film. It achieves what Bruce intended, a real contest between two real people in which both fighters have weight and dignity and the outcome costs something. Chuck's performance was what it needed to be, which is to say it was fully committed, which is to say he showed everything, which is to say the loss at the end of the sequence registers as genuine loss rather than scripted result. You believe that this man could have won, and the belief is essential to the meaning of the scene. They continued to train together after the Rome production wrapped, meeting in Los Angeles when their schedules permitted, which was less often than either of them wanted, and more often than their respective professional lives should have allowed. They had the kind of friendship that does not require continuity to maintain its depth, the kind built on a sufficient accumulation of honest exchange that it can sustain intervals without diminishing. Chuck would later say that his friendship with Bruce was one of the most significant of his life, and he would say it without the inflation that such statements usually carry, in the flat, accurate tone of someone for whom the statement is simply true. Bruce Lee died in Hong Kong on July 20th, 1973. He was 32 years old. The cause was given as a cerebral edema, a reaction to a painkiller he had been given for a headache. He had been complaining of headaches for months. The specific mechanism of his death remained a subject of medical discussion for decades. What was not in discussion was the fact of it, which arrived in the world with the finality of things that cannot be adjusted or corrected. Chuck was in Los Angeles when he heard. The manner in which he learned and the specific circumstances of the days that followed are not part of the public record in any detail, because he was not someone who processed grief in public, and because the culture of the martial arts world in 1973 did not create the structures through which such processing occurs in public. What the people around him reported was that he went very quiet, and that the quiet lasted for a long time, and that it was not the quiet of blankness, but of interior activity, of something being worked through in the same way that training problems were worked through, with patience and honesty and the willingness to stay with the difficulty until it yielded something useful. He trained harder in the months after Bruce's death. This is the account of people who were around him at the time, and it is not offered as a compensatory narrative, but as a factual observation. He increased the volume and the intensity of his practice and the scope of what he was studying, and the direction of his study began to shift in ways that would take years to fully manifest. He began to examine more systematically the limits of what he knew and the way those limits had been revealed to him in training, and the examination pointed back, again and again, to the specific nature of the challenge that Bruce had represented, the productive kind of worry, the kind where someone can show you your own limits in a way you cannot show yourself. The Way of the Dragon was released in Hong Kong in December of 1972 and became one of the highest-grossing films in the territory's history at that point. It was released in the United States in a dubbed version, under the title Return of the Dragon in 1974, the year after Bruce's death, and it reached an American audience that was still processing the loss and that found in the Coliseum sequence, and in Chuck's performance specifically, something they had not expected. A fighter who was good enough to make the thing mean something. A fighter who had done his job so well that the scene's conclusion registered as tragedy rather than inevitability. Critics at the time did not have the vocabulary to describe what Chuck was doing in that scene, because the vocabulary for discussing martial arts film performance as a discipline did not yet exist. They said things like convincing and capable and gave the impression of genuine skill. What they were seeing, and lacked the frame to name, was a man who had been asked to demonstrate his own limits in service of someone else's story, and who had done it without reservation, because he understood that this was the most honest thing he could do. And because honesty was, for him, not a value he had chosen, but a condition he had arrived at through sufficient time in training rooms where the truth of a thing is made immediately apparent by whether or not it works. Larry Harbour kept the memory of the September evening in the production office with the same care he gave to things he understood to be significant. He did not tell it often because it was not the kind of story that works in all contexts, the kind of story that requires the right kind of listener to receive it correctly. It is not a story about greatness, not exactly. It is a story about two men who were serious about a subject and who had arrived. From different directions, at a similar understanding of what seriousness in that subject required, which is the acknowledgement that there exists, in any honest practice of a physical art, someone or something that will show you your own edge, and that the correct response to this is not to move away from the edge, but to remain at it, which is a more demanding position than it sounds. A great teacher, someone said once in Chuck's presence, is not someone who makes you better than yourself. A great teacher is someone who makes you more accurately yourself than you have managed to be alone. The best training partners are teachers in this sense. They are the ones who show you where you actually are, rather than where you think you are. And the showing is done not through explanation, but through the specific pressure of their own reality meeting yours. Bruce Lee had said that Chuck was the only man who worried him in the productive sense, which is to say, in the sense of the edge. He said it once in the same tone he might have used to note the ambient temperature and then moved on. He did not require it to be a moment. It was a fact, and facts did not require ceremonies. Chuck Norris never mentioned this account publicly. It existed in Larry Harbour's memory and in the accounts of the people Harbour told over the years, and it existed in the specific texture of the Colosseum sequence, in the quality of Chuck's performance, in the specific weight of the loss at the scene's conclusion that makes the viewer feel something real, something that would not have been possible if the man on the other side of the screen had been anything less than completely serious about the work. The Way of the Dragon, the production office near Cinecittà, the warm September evening, the cold coffee, the schedule for the following week's shoot lying on the desk, Bruce Lee looking at the window with a particular look of someone reporting an accurate observation, the production assistant setting down his pencil, Chuck not saying anything back, which was the right response. Rome, Italy, September 1971.